So this is post-World War II era, 1945 to 1952, what most people call post-war America. You see the picture up here, the famous picture of the sailor molesting the woman here in Times Square, although that's how we would characterize it today. I'm sure it was a lot more innocent back then. I mean, the relief, the euphoria, the joy, I mean, all of that can be expressed here through this picture. The belief that once World War II was over, that this was an opportunity for the world to remake itself. And really, the only power left standing at the end of World War II was the United States. And so a lot of people saw this as an opportunity for the United States to remake the world in its image. But there was a snag to all of that, and that was the Russians. And the Russians, at the end of World War II, seemed to be the biggest obstacle to a world that the United States could, remake on in its own image. Now, the relationship between the United States and Russia. Remember, those two countries are allies during World War II. They're both fighting against Nazi Germany. But as the war is winding down, that relationship of convenience is deteriorating. It is breaking apart. Most people point to the Yalta Conference of January 1945 as the beginning of the end of the cooperation between the Americans and the Russians. Why would you look to Yalta? What happened at Yalta, or what didn't happen at Yalta that would cause that deterioration? Yeah.
The Russians promised free elections for all but the captured territories of the Soviet.
Okay, the Eastern European countries that the Soviets had liberated from Nazi control, Stalin had given assurances to the Americans at Yalta and to Franklin Roosevelt personally that they would oversee free democratic elections in Eastern Europe. And that was really something that, we were, trying to press. Democracy, Roosevelt talked about it before the war in the Four Freedoms speech. The right of people to choose their own destiny. And so, in Roosevelt's mind, that's, the idea of promoting democracy. So this idea of promoting democracy in places that had been liberated from Nazi control and Japanese control and whatever was paramount. It was a paramount objective of Franklin Roosevelt. But Roosevelt, in January of 1945, by the way, he had just been inaugurated for a, God knows, fourth term. Okay, he had been elected again for a fourth term. He's working on his third vice president in January 1945. He is not long for this world. Roosevelt dies a month before Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945. He dies April 12th, 1945 in Warm Springs, Georgia. And the post-war world is left to his successor, a man who had been on the job all of 88 days. Okay? The man had been vice president 88 days. And that was Harry Truman. Now, nobody thought much of Harry Truman. Harry Truman had been a compromise candidate for vice president. He was a two-term senator from Missouri. Most people thought of him as a rube, as a political hack, not very bright, didn't have a college degree. He only had a high school diploma. His claim to fame before he had been in politics was that he owned an underwear store out in Independence, Missouri. So nobody really gave Harry Truman much consideration. Yet it's Truman who calls the Russians out, recognizes that the Russians are not owning up to their agreements, that they had signed at Yalta, calls them out in the summer of 1945 at Potsdam, which is a suburb of Berlin. The leaders of Britain, the United States, and Russia got together in the summer of 1945 to discuss what was going to happen vis-a-vis Japan. In July 1945, Germany had surrendered, but Japan had not yet surrendered. And so there was that question mark that was left hanging over the proceedings. And, you know, by July 1945, a lot of Americans thought that we were going to have to invade Japan, we were going to have to occupy Japan, it was going to cost 1 to 2 million American soldiers' lives, it was going to cost 10 to 15 million Japanese citizens' lives, it was going to take 3 more years of war. There was that feeling in 1945 that World War II, while it may be winding down in Europe, was far from over. So that's why back in January 1945, Roosevelt got an assurance from Stalin that Stalin and the Russians would declare war on Japan 3 months after Germany surrendered. Russia had never declared war on Japan. Throughout all of World War II, Russia had never declared war on Japan. They were only at war with Germany. But in January 1945, we needed help in getting rid of the Japanese and defeating the Japanese. So, if we're going to have to invade Japan and we're going to have to spend money and kill people to do it, we'd like as many people to help us out as possible. That's why we got the promise for Russia to declare war in January 1945. By July 1945, Harry Truman does not want the Russians declaring war on Japan. Because the Russians have made it clear by the summer of 1945 that any territory they walk across, they are taking. And the last thing that America wants is Russia laying claim to territory in Asia. It's already a fait accompli. It's already happened that Russia is in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Hungary and Yugoslavia and Bulgaria in Europe. The last thing we need is Russia laying claim to Korea and China and Japan and all this other Asian territory. So if we can end the war quickly before the Russians declare war on Japan, in Harry Truman's mind, that's just great. The ace up Harry Truman's sleeve in July 1945, the reason why he's able to confront the Russians, the reason why he's able to tell the Russians to essentially go fly, is because in July 1945, while he's at Potsdam, Harry Truman learns of the successful testing of the Manhattan Project. The successful testing of the atomic bomb, July 17, 1945, in Alamogordo, New Mexico. The first atomic bomb was successfully tested. Truman, in Truman's mind, he's saying to himself, I've got an atomic bomb. What the hell do I need the Russians for? And if the Russians give me any lip, bam! Atomic bomb! So that's really where Truman is proceeding from. Now, the thing that Truman had no idea of was that Stalin already knew about the atomic bomb. Stalin was already working on his own atomic bomb. But that's a story for later. Okay? Right now, this is the atomic bomb, that's a big secret. And it allows Truman to issue what's called the Potsdam Declaration. And the Potsdam Declaration is basically an ultimatum to Japan. Surrender or else. else what? Or else you fill in the blank. And when Japan doesn't surrender, we drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. We drop the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later. 7 days later, Japan surrenders. And in the middle of all that, the Russians managed to declare war on Japan. So, here's the reality of the post-war world. Europe is divided between those countries that side and support the United States and those countries and territories that are under the thumb of the Russians. And Truman is saying to himself, the last thing we need is any more incursions of communism into territories of Western Europe. Does anybody know where the flashpoint in Europe is? Where all of the divisions kind of come together in one spot? Germany, Berlin, absolutely. Okay? Germany, part of the Yalta Agreement was that Germany would be divided into zones of occupation. A British, American, a French, why the French got a zone, I have no idea. British, American, French, and a Russian zone. Yeah.
Is there a middle American up in that British little, see it right there?
Yeah, I don't know. Probably it was an important base. Now, the thing that really is the sticking point, and the thing that really sticks in Stalin's craw, is that Berlin is also occupied by all the Allies. So in the middle of this Russian zone, you've got Americans, French, and British. And the Russians want nothing more than to extricate, remove that American presence from its territory. So Berlin is going to become a flashpoint in what becomes known as the Cold War. This conflict of ideas between America and the Soviet Union. The other place where you see division is on the Korean Peninsula. Russia had declared war on Japan, had been at war with Japan for 7 days. That gave them claim to territory. And what the Russians got was they got to occupy the northern Korean peninsula. They established a pro-communist government in North Korea. We established a pro-American government in South Korea, and we've been dealing with the after effects ever since. I mean, Kim Jong-un, is that his name, Kim Jong-un? Yeah, that's the grandson of the guy that Stalin put in charge of North Korea. So we've been dealing with this family now for 70 years. Okay, we've been dealing with the after effects of this. So this is also going to become a flashpoint. I would not be surprised if you saw conflict occurring here as well. Now, despite the tension, despite the division, despite all the negativity out there, the negative vibes, a lot of people believe that whatever problems exist can be ameliorated, solved by the United Nations. Because the United Nations has the ability of collective security, something the League of Nations did not. The United Nations has a Security Council made up of 15 members. 10 of those members are on a rotating basis, but there are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And those 5 permanent members are the winners War II, the U.S., Britain, France, China, and, the Russians. And here's the thing. Each one of these 5 permanent members has what's called veto power. So the Security Council could vote 14-1 on a resolution. And if one of those no votes is one of those 5 permanent members, it doesn't happen. Surely, there won't be any problems here with the U.S. and the Russians. Who thought that was a good idea? Franklin Roosevelt did. When they were hashing this all out, when we were friends with the Russians, we were buddies. We were working together.
Ukraine.
Yeah. What about Ukraine? Yeah. Okay. I have no idea what that has to do with the Security Council. That's all right. If you feel free to, just say whatever pops into your head, and that's fine. All right. So what winds up happening is, and I think you can see this, is that the UN winds up getting bogged down in debate and vetoes. Okay? So really, the UN does not perform its role the way the founders of the UN had intended it to perform. Now, we were content at the end of World War II to power down, to reap the benefits of the post-war world, to disassemble our army, dismantle our tanks, throw away our guns, scrap our ships, get rid of our airplanes. America wanted to demobilize from war at the end of World War II. The budget for the military was slashed. The military was cut drastically. It took Winston Churchill to smack the United States around and say, "Idiots, wake up!" In 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is delivering a speech in Fulton, Missouri. In this speech, he makes an admonition, a warning to the United States. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the United States stands at this time at the pinnacle of world power. It is a solemn moment for the American democracy. For with primacy in power is also joined an awe-inspiring accountability to the future." Will somebody please translate what that means? Think Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. That's right. Uncle Ben might as well be Winston Churchill, because that's what Churchill is saying here. He says, United States, for 300 years, Great Britain used to be the country that could get things done. We don't have the money, we don't have the military, we don't have the energy to do it anymore. It's up to you to do it. You have the atomic bomb. You have the largest navy in the world. You have the largest army in the world. It is up to the United States to now take on the role that Great Britain had had for 300 years, that of kind of policing the world. It's known as the Iron Curtain speech, and it does not mean that an Iron Curtain was built across Europe. It is figurative. It is metaphoric. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent of Europe, beyond which lie all the ancient capitals of Eastern Europe. He's trying to wake America out of its complacency and desire to go back into its turtle shell. He's saying you cannot do that anymore. Because when America does that, bad things happen. So the Iron Curtain speech is really kind of a wake-up call for the United States that it has to be more engaged on the world sphere. Now, if our job is to confront this Russian menace, this threat of the spread of communism, how then should we best confront it? Should we drop a bunch of atomic bombs on Moscow, as General George S. Patton suggested with the Third Army? Should we just, honest to God, Patton at the end of World War II said, why are we stopping at Berlin? We should just go right on to Moscow. Is that how you do it? Or do you confront the Russians in a different way? The guy who outlines that approach to confronting the Russians is a guy named George Kennan. Now, the reason why George Kennan is such a prominent figure is because he is America's diplomat in Russia during World War II. He's there for 4 years. He knows the Russian people. He speaks Russian. He understands the Russian mentality. And he says to Truman in a telegram that becomes known as the X-telegram or the long telegram. It's called the X-telegram because he signs it Mr. X. Like nobody knows it's George Kennan. But he says, look, in order to confront the Russians, you don't confront them directly with military. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with war in perpetuity. We must formulate and put forward for other nations a much more positive and constructive picture of the sort of world we would like to see that we have put forward in the past. It is not enough, Reed, for us to urge people to develop political processes similar to our own. Many foreign peoples in Europe, at least, are tired and frightened by experiences of the past and are less interested in abstract freedom than in security. They are seeking guidance rather than responsibilities. We should be better able than the Russians to give them this, and unless we do, the Russians certainly will. What is Kennan saying? What do we have to do? Yeah.
We've got to install American governments in countries before the Russians can.
We not only have to install pro-American governments, we have to back and support pro-American governments. We have to be directly involved in these countries. Wherever our interests are at stake, we've got to be directly involved with financial aid, military aid, propping up governments wherever we can in order to block the expansion of the Russians. And we've got to provide a better example to the world than the Russians will provide. Because he's saying, quite frankly, Europe doesn't care which type of government to go with. They're going to go with the government that provides them the best security. So we've got to provide a better example than the Russians do. Kennan's belief that America should prop up governments, provide aid, provide weapons, provide support to countries becomes known as a policy of containment, putting constant, peaceful pressure on the Russians until the Russian system collapses. Kennan says the Russian system is inherently weak, and if you put enough pressure on it, it will collapse. He likens it to a rotten apple. What is so weak about the communist system? Everybody gets paid the same. Everybody's provided with everything they need. Everybody is equal. What's wrong with that? Yeah. There's no social mobility. There's no impetus to do something better or to improve something or to innovate he says that the Russian society economically and philosophically is stagnant, that it will never innovate. It will copy, but it will never innovate. And so therefore, the Russian system is inherently weak. Therefore, if you put enough pressure on it, it will collapse. Now, it takes 45 years. And if you're willing to see a policy through for 45 years, that's great. And you've got every president from Truman to Reagan who does it. But you know what? It worked. Soviet Union collapsed December 25th, 1991. Kennan was alive to see it. So you've got to be, guys, you can't just be willing to go in with boots on the ground. I mean, that's the easy approach. That's the simple approach. It's also the costly approach and the deadly approach. But if you're willing to put pressure on a country and wait it out, if the country is weak enough, it will acquiesce to what you want. The answer isn't always boots on the ground. Although, in 1947, Harry Truman makes sure that there are boots on the ground. Now, they are not American boots. They are Greek boots and Turkish boots. The Russians are trying to get communist governments in Greece and Turkey, and the United States arms and supplies the Greek and Turkish pro-American forces to keep the Russians from claiming these two countries as territory. Notice where we're at. Here's Crimea. Why are the Russians interested in Greek and Turkish control? Yeah.
They want to get
The Straits of the Dardanelles, so they can get their Black Seas fleet out. Absolutely. So, in what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, Harry Truman announces that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities, read communists, or by outside pressure, read Russia. So basically, we're going to help out any country who's fighting the commies. Now, that could take the form of weapons, it could take the form of information, it could take the form of aid, it could take the form of whatever. We can be creative. It doesn't always have to be American boots on the ground. For instance, 1948. This is containment. Secretary of State George Marshall, who had been Chief of the Army during World War II, now he's Secretary of State. He announces a European recovery aid package. The United States is going to give billions of dollars to Western Europe to rebuild their economies, rebuild their infrastructure, rebuild their cities. That's Truman Doctrine. It's just financial aid rather than military aid. But you are economically propping up these countries. And if they are economically propped up, they are less likely to go down the road of communism. They become economically successful, and guess what they wind up doing when their economies are back online?
Trading with us.
They trade with us. They buy our stuff. Exactly. And they are friendly governments. And here's the caveat. Marshall says to these Western European countries, in order to receive this aid, you must agree to work together to reduce tariffs and become more economically united. What is the Marshall Plan really the beginning of? The European Union. Yeah. The European Union derives from this. It becomes known as the European Common Market in the 1950s, and the European Common Market becomes the EU in the 1990s. But this was all economic. So, I love these people online who sit there and go, hey, why are we giving billions of dollars in economic aid to these countries around the world we don't care about? We got our own problems to deal with. Guys, we are propping up these countries so that they don't become problems. Sometimes it costs a little money to do that. I mean, look, there were Americans who thought we were throwing money down a hole to do this. Hey, why are we giving money to them Europeans? What have they ever done for us? Guys, you got to think bigger picture. Now, when the Russians try to squeeze us out, blackhead-like, out of Berlin, we respond with an airlift. Truman could have responded with nukes. He could have responded with American boots on the ground. He could have invaded East Germany. But instead, or he could have just let Berlin go, which was politically untenable for Truman. But what he did was he decided we're going to maintain our presence in West Berlin, and if the Russians want to make something of it, let them fire the first shot. So this was kind of a game of chicken here. And the Russians blinked. We kept West Berlin online. We kept them supplied. We kept them, with round-the-clock, 24/7 airdrops. And we confronted the Russians here, and we were successful. We maintained our position in West Berlin. It's a result of the Berlin airlift and the desire to get Western European countries all on the same page that leads in 1949 to the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You remember George Washington, what he warned at the end of his presidency? Avoid entangling alliances. Guess what? This is an entangling alliance. We've been a member of NATO since 1949. An attack on one member is an attack on all members. It was originally meant as a confronting of the Russians, of the communists. You want to get to the Ukraine, NATO is being invoked here. Because while the Ukraine is not a member of NATO, other countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc are now members of NATO. And we've made it clear that if any of those countries are even messed with, we will confront the Russians. That is part of NATO. Now, 1949, we're riding high foreign policy-wise. We have the atomic bomb. We've got the largest navy in the world. We've got the richest economy in the world. We're blocking the Russians in Berlin. We're forming NATO. We're providing aid and weapons to the Greeks and the Turks. We're keeping the Russians at bay there. Everything's looking great foreign policy-wise. And then, 1949, you have the Soviets exploding their first atomic bomb, and everybody in America goes, oh my God, how in the world did they get that? How did they get an atomic bomb so quickly? It took us 8 years to figure it out. They did. They had some help. When the Soviets explode the atomic bomb, State Department official Paul Nitze outlines in a memo called National Security Council Memo, NSC, National Security Council Memo, NSC 68, that it needs to be the goal of the United States to be able to defend the Western Hemisphere and protect a mobilization base by conducting offensive operations, by defending and maintaining lines of communication and providing aid to our allies. At the end of World War II, we wanted to destroy our tanks, scrap our ships, draw down our army. Nietzsche says we cannot do that. We must maintain constant mobilization, as if we are continually at war. There is no peace dividend. We do not have the luxury of beating our swords into plowshares. We must maintain constant mobilization and vigilance. If we're going to build a class of submarines, we need to be working on the next class of submarines that improves on that previous class. If we're working on a tank right now, we need to be thinking about the next line of tanks that's going to improve on that. We need to be constantly manufacturing war materials. All right. Now, that's foreign policy. 1945 to 52, you've also got domestic stuff. What's happening here at home in the United States? Well, at the end of World War II, you have the government cutting defense spending. Initially, in 1945-46, when the war is over, there's no need for tanks and planes and ships and all that stuff. Nietzsche's memo won't come out for another 3 years. And you wind up having, in 1946, a post-war recession. All that war manufacturing that had been going on, where the economy had been stimulated by war production during World War II, is going to lead, that's going to come to an end, and it's going to lead to a recession, and this is the recession right here, the 1940s recession, in blue. Okay? Unemployment rose, wages dropped. There's no longer a need for all these war materials. Wage and price controls were lifted. They'd set in place wages and prices during World War II to prevent gouging. Those are lifted, and what winds up happening is there's a shortage of consumer goods, there's a shortage of other mass-produced goods, so unemployment goes up, wages drop, prices go up. Economically, post-World War II looks a heck of a lot like post-World War I. They hadn't planned for the transition. By the way, this shows you all the post-World War II recessions that we've had over the past 70 years. Here's the one in the 1940s. Here's the one we just went through. It is the deepest, it is the longest post-war economic downturn since the Great Depression. This is showing you how many months of unemployment you've got. Notice the last three. 07, 01, 1990. That recessions have been lasting longer. They've been going, unemployment has been going longer. It's been taking longer to rebound from these economic downturns. Even the one in 1981. No. Even the one in 1981. Here you go. 81, 90, 2001, 2007. I'm wondering why these are so short. and these are so long? It's a great question. Why does it take so long for us to get out of economic downturn since 1980? Anybody want to take a stab? Anybody want to take a stab at why it took so short for us to get out of recessions earlier? How did Roosevelt attempt to get us out of the Depression?
The New Deal.
New Deal. Government spending. Since 1980, Ronald Reagan, the Republicans, have basically dominated the economic agenda. They have not been willing to provide as much government spending, government stimulus. Yes, you had a huge stimulus package during this last economic downturn, but as the Fed chair and the head of the Federal Reserve said, it wasn't enough. So at the end of World War II, you got a lot of post-war strikes, you got a lot of labor problems. It's caused by World War II wage and price freezes being lifted. The railroad workers go on strike. Truman takes over the railroads. Has the government take over the railroads. Can he do that? He did it. I don't know. The United Steelworkers go on strike. Truman threatens to draft the steelworkers into the army. Can he do that? I don't know. He did it. The United Mine Workers with John Lewis and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, they organize a massive nationwide mine strike. 350,000 mine workers go on strike. The longshoremen, these are the guys that unload the ships at the ports. They go on strike across the country. A lot of city and municipal employees go on strike. These strikes are hobbling our post-war economic recovery. So the Republicans in Congress decide to attack unions. And they pass through Congress something called the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Remember how during the 1930s, Roosevelt and the New Deal have been really good friends to labor unions? The Wagner Act, National Labor Relations Board, letting unions, have the ability to go on strike, letting them have the ability to collectively bargain for their salary. Well, the Republicans, through the Taft-Hartley Act, are going to restrict the freedom of labor unions. They are going to outlaw what are called closed-shop unions, places where you go to work where you have to join a union. Today, Republicans call it right to work. See, it sounds more positive when you say right to work than forbidding formation of unions. You can't just go on strike anymore. You have what's called a mandatory cooling off period before you can declare a strike. And our old friend government injunctions are allowed once again. Yeah.
Doesn't all that make it worse?
What do you mean?
Like, wouldn't the labor unions be more angry at the government?
Oh, absolutely. They called the Taft-Hartley Act the Slave Labor Bill of 1947. The Republicans are purposefully going after labor unions in the 1940s because they formed the base of the Democratic Party, just like Republicans go after labor unions today because they form the base of the Democratic Party. And the Republicans are able to override Truman's veto. Truman had vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, but Truman and the Democrats had been beaten so badly in the 1946 congressional elections that the Republicans had a veto-proof majority in the House and the Senate. So Truman in 1947 is essentially dead man walking. He's politically dead. Most people looked at Harry Truman as just a placeholder. as domestic spending gets back online, you start to see a post-war economic boom. What John Kenneth Galbraith called the affluent society. This, think about this. At the end of World War II, who's making anything around the world? Is Germany? No. Is England? No. France? No. China? They're in the middle of a civil war. Japan? They've been nuked. Guys, we are the only game in town. We are the only manufacturer in the world who was untouched by World War II. That is why we are able to have such an economic boom. We don't have any competition. You're buying a car, you're buying an American car. You're buying a refrigerator, you're buying an American refrigerator. You're buying a washing machine, you're buying an American washing machine because nobody else is making them. You're buying steel, you're buying American steel. That's why companies were able to provide so many jobs and provide such benefits and provide such high wages. And it's why we were able to create such a high standard of living after World War II. People sit there all the time and they lament the death of the American middle class. Well, that's because we had a middle class because we could. We didn't have any competition around the world. But now, we've got competition in Europe, we've got competition from China, competition from Japan, competition from Southeast Asia, competition from everywhere around the globe. And high-wage jobs cannot compete with that. There are a number of factors that come together to produce the baby boom. First of all, the end of the war. Men come home, they haven't seen their wives and their girlfriends in 3 or 4 years. 9 months later, babies. Iggity, aggity, ook, babies. The stork arrives. But there is also a baby boom because housing is cheap and affordable, and also because there are plentiful amounts of high-paying, good jobs. People are going to have kids in that kind of environment. And so the baby boom happens between 1945 and 1964. It's this massive surge in the number of births here in the United States. You can see it right here. It's almost like a rat going through a snake.
Mr. Epley's here somewhere.
Yeah, Mr. Epley's in, I think, right. No, he's here. He's there. I mean, hold on. Maybe he's all the way back. Hold on. Maybe he's all the way back here. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, now, guys, as that rat goes through the snake, think of what it's going to influence as it goes through. 1945 to 50. What businesses are going to be booming?
Like kids' furniture.
Kids' furniture, crib manufacturing, Gerber baby food, diapers. 1955 to 1960. What's going to be booming in America?
Child's toys.
What?
Children's toys.
Children's toys, yeah, sure. What else with all these kids, what else is going to have to happen around a lot of hospitals, schools? Guys, go around Anne Arundel County and look at when the schools were built. Look at the cornerstones, when they were built. Most of them were built in the 50s. By the 1960s, where are these people? They're teenagers.
Yeah.
They're influenced by Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And America's teenagers are like, oh, he's so cute. I just want to go do whatever he says. And then when Kennedy's assassinated, and the Vietnam War happens, these are the guys that protest the war and protest racism and protest gender discrimination and, form the National Organization of Women to protest wage discrimination in the workplace. And they form, the civil rights organizations, and not just the nice ones like, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but also like the Black Power movement, where they're, promoting a more, aggressive agenda. These are the guys that are fighting for the rights of American Indians and Latinos, Cesar Chavez in the 1960s. And by the 1970s, where are they? How old are they? 30. In the 1970s, they're 30. They've left youthful indiscretions, sex, drugs, and rock and roll behind. And what are people who are 30 interested in? Self-improvement. Jogging or yogging. Is it a silent J? I'm not sure. Yogging. But guys, in the 1970s, yoga, exercise, jogging, the health food revolution, things like that become what's known as the me decade in the 1970s. In the 1980s, how old are they? In their 40s. They are at the peak of their purchasing power. Like Homer Simpson says, I'm a white male 18 to 45. People will do whatever I say, no matter how stupid it is. They are at the peak of their cultural influence, the peak of their purchasing power, the peak of their wealth. They are managers and bosses and whatnot. They're running companies. They are Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and those guys and Bill Gates. In the 1990s, where are they? How old are they? They're in their 50s. They're having midlife crises.
Yeah, they're buying Harley Davidsons.
They're buying Harley Davidsons, exactly. And they're working on their second or third lives. Where are they today?
60s, 70s.
Social Security.
They are draining the Social Security system. Yeah. So they have had an impact since the end of World War II, going all the way through the late 20th century. It is. It's a wave. Now look, I'm here. That's me. I am what's part of what's known as the baby bust. That's where people were like, my God, these kids are actually work. We got to do things with them. But these guys had kids here. And so you see this kind of undulation in the population since the 1940s. It's really remarkable to look at and then think about what kind of impact they're having. These guys, their kids are going to high school now. That's why Southern's enrollment is only 1,054 or whatever the population was. When I started here, Southern's enrollment was 1,300. Now, that enrollment is projected to pick back up in the next 10 years because these guys are having kids.
That's awesome.
That's us.
1980?
No, it's not.
This is
like
Brace. This is Mr. Brace, right here. But eventually you'll have kids. God help us all. All right. Just remember to read to them, please. Just read to your kids every night. Read to your kids, starting when they can't even understand the word. Just read to your kids every night. They will have the literacy skills when they go to school. Congress does pass something wise. It's called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. We call it the GI Bill. Basically, it says if you served your country during World War II, the government will pay for you to go to college. That is a good deal. That is as good a deal as you get. Now, what that winds up doing generation of college graduates that would not normally have been college graduates. And college graduates means higher income. Over the course of a lifetime, a person with a college degree earns today about $1 million more that over the course of a lifetime than a person without a college degree. So this helps create that post-war economic boom. Now, Harry Truman sees himself as the continuation of FDR, and he believes that we have the ability to not just take what we had done in the New Deal, but we can expand it. And Harry Truman comes up with this really big pie-in-the-sky idea called the Fair Deal. He proposes universal education from pre-K to college. The government would pay for everybody to go to college. He proposes national health care. He proposes government-funded housing. For anybody who's homeless, we'll give you a house. Anybody who wants a job, we'll get you a job. And this is the first president since Grant. Think about that. This is the first president since Grant to propose a civil rights bill. It is all promptly vetoed by the Republicans in Congress. The Republicans who had won election in 1946 in those disastrous midterm elections, Truman can't get anything through Congress. His fair deal is dead on arrival. No education, no health care for anybody, no houses for anybody, jobs, screw them. Civil rights, you're on your own. Now, Truman is going to take that and he's going to run with it. In 1948, Truman's going to run for a term in his own right. Remember, he inherited Franklin Roosevelt's term. So in 1948, Harry Truman announces he's going to run for a term in his own right. Nobody gives Harry Truman a chance. The Republican nominee who had run against FDR in 1944, everybody thought this guy's going to win in 1948. His name was Thomas Dewey, governor of New York. Very popular guy. Dewey was measuring the drapes for the Oval Office. He was ready to go. 1948. Everybody knew that the Republicans were going to win. But Truman campaigned against what he called the Do-Nothing Congress. He said, I've proposed bills to provide jobs and schooling and housing and all this stuff, and they've blocked it at every turn. I challenge the Republicans to come here and offer their own agenda. But they won't because they're not interested in governing. They're interested in just saying no. Truman runs with that in 1948 and wins. Beats Thomas Dewey. But wait a minute. Uh-oh. I'll show you something.
What are those?
What are these?
What are those things?
What's that? What's that down there? Hey! What's that down there? Who are those guys? You tell me.
What's not counted?
Oh, they were counted.
The KKK.
Why are they running against Harry Truman? Harry Truman's a Democrat.
Civil rights.
Harry Truman had the audacity to propose a civil rights bill. And Harry Truman in 1948 had also announced through executive order the desegregation of the armed forces. Harry Truman is the real civil rights pioneer here. Now, this is a guy who used the N-word on a regular basis. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It wasn't a Ku Klux Klan party, but I'll explain who they are. Truman surprises, and look, here's the newspaper from Chicago. Dewey defeats Truman. Everybody predicted that Dewey was going to beat Truman. It's these guys. They're called Dixiecrats. These are Southern Democrats who had been traditionally a part of the Democratic Party, who believed that the Democratic Party that was promoting civil rights was leaving them. You hear these guys say this all the time. I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. That's code for the Democrats embrace civil rights. J. Strom Thurmond, at the ripe age of 36, is the Dixiecrat nominee for president in 1948. And he says in 1948, I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, there's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the race into our theaters, into our swimming pools. You thought I was going to say it. Into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches. Yeah, this guy. Now, what does he do after the 48 election? Oh, not much. Just gets elected to the Senate and serves for 52 years as the senator from South Carolina. He died in 2002.
He was yeah.
Oh, yeah. Now, if you want to delve a little deeper, again, this class is a mile wide and a millimeter deep. You want to delve a little deeper? Go looking into this guy's personal life and find out the illegitimate children he had with the black housekeeper. Yes. Yes.
So this is so
Yes.
he racist the whole time he was
In public office, he had a change of heart in the 1980s when it was becoming apparent that civil rights was going to stay. He had a change of heart. Yeah. There's a great deal of fear and anxiety at the end of World War II. What becomes known as the Red Scare, and that's predominantly because of what happens in Truman's second term. Remember what I've said? Second term suck. And Harry Truman, the pinnacle of Harry Truman's career is that win in 1948. He might as well not even have run, because his second term is absolutely disastrous. Why? Not only did the Soviets explode an A-bomb in 1949, but China goes communist in 1949. Now, everybody blames Truman for losing China to the communists. How did you lose China? What happened? Didn't you know that Mao Zedong and the communists were going to take over China? What happened here? Truman gets the blame. He gets the blame for the Soviets getting the A-bomb. He gets the blame for the Chinese going communist. And the following year, when communist North Korea invades non-communist South Korea, Truman decides he's going to make a stand. He had gotten nailed on China. So in 1950, Truman says, fine, we're going to put boots on the ground. And you have what becomes known as the Korean War. Now, the Korean War, you've got communist North Korea with the Chinese and the Russians backing North Korea. They send a force across the 37th parallel. America has an armed force. It's complicated, but I'm going to tell you it's under UN Security Council auspices, which it was because the Russians were boycotting the Security Council the day that we authorized this. The forces are under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur tells Truman, look, I've got a proposal to win this thing now. I propose we drop 50 atomic bombs along the Chinese-North Korean border and create what he called a zone of death. And when the Chinese invaded Korea and entered this war, this thing threatened to get out of hand. It threatened to turn into World War III right here. The Chinese communists come in, the North Koreans are there, the Russians are supplying military weapons and whatnot. Truman's got a big decision to make. Does he want to win this thing? Or does he want to just contain the communist expansion? Truman can't have Douglas MacArthur out there yelling about 50 atomic bombs. And when Truman tells MacArthur no, and MacArthur goes and complains to the Republicans in Congress, he's technically violating his chain of command. He is going against the commander-in-chief. And so, Truman fires MacArthur. Now, you got to keep in mind that Truman's got about a 30% approval rating at this time, and MacArthur's got about a 75% approval rating. But Truman fires MacArthur in 1950 for breaking the chain of command and for going around the president to try to convince the Republicans in Congress that Truman doesn't want to win this war. And that becomes kind of the label that's smeared on Truman, is that Truman is not interested in winning a war. And Truman would be the first to tell you, my goal here isn't to liberate Korea. My goal here is to contain communism. And so what winds up happening is the Korean War for 3 years gets bogged down in a quagmire game. With the communists on one side, the Americans on the other, and this is pretty much where the war ends. Right here. I mean, we're still holding that line today. So how did the Chinese go communist? Why did North Korea invade South Korea? How did the Russians get an atomic bomb? The communists must be everywhere. They're everywhere. They could be in your own country. And you start to see the emergence of a Red Scare. After the Soviets explode the atomic bomb, after the Chinese go communist, after, the Korean War bogs down in this quagmire, politicians are going to take advantage of that and label their political opponents as communists and socialists. They go after what they call the Roosevelt Red Record. They go back and they look at the New Deal, because obviously that was communism. And you get people like Joseph McCarthy and Richard Nixon coming to the national forefront, basically labeling people as communists. Where are the communists? We need to find the communists. They're out there somewhere. And look, there's enough smoke. There's enough smoke, man. For instance, the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, it was discovered that they had sold atomic bomb secrets to the Russians. That's how the Russians were able to get an atomic bomb. They were tried, convicted, and executed for espionage. In the wake of that, the House and the Senate formed committees to investigate instances and allegations of communism. The House forms the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. The Senate launches its own investigations, and they target Hollywood, liberals, intellectuals, New Dealers, labor leaders. Al Alger Hiss, who was a State Department official who was advising Franklin Roosevelt at Yalta, was accused of being a pawn for the Russians. Why did Roosevelt sell out Eastern Europe to the Russians at Yalta? Because Alger Hiss told him to do so. And who uncovered that little chestnut? Representative Richard Nixon of California. That's right. Hiss sold out the Americans to the Russians.
Morning 7. Today is Wednesday, April 23rd, a V-Day. Please stand for your pledge of allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Attention, National Honor Society meeting on Wednesday, April 30th during Bulldog Block. And attention to the new National Honor Society inductees.
So guys,
Please
people
return your
like
written forms
Joseph
to Ms. Weibel
McCarthy,
by April 26th.
people like Richard Nixon were able to gain
Did you
national
not pick up your
fame
announcement from
by
John?
accusing various members of society of being communists, and you wind up
Art Quest
ginning up this
2014 is this Thursday.
You
That's
wind up
tomorrow,
chinning up this
6:30 to
paranoia
9 p.m.
and fear
Any
and
last
playing
minute
on
Art Quest
Americans'
t-shirt must be
fears
turned in to your
about
art teacher
communists.
as soon as possible. Faculty, instructions for casting your faculty people's choice.
So much so
Email
that the
next
government
week.
passes
See
something
everyone
called the
this Thursday
McCarran
at Art
Internal
Quest.
Security Act, which mandates
course
that
verification
anybody
change
working for the
contracts
U.S.
back on
government
Friday,
has to
April 26th.
pass a
If you did not
loyalty oath,
pick up-
has to
pick
give
them
a
up on
loyalty
Friday,
oath and
pick
pass
them up at your
investigation.
period. Students, please pick up your report card at
In
all free lunches in the
1952.
cafeteria. Also, there are some students that need their course selections for next year. You can get that at lunch too.
In 1952,
Attention,
the American
lunchtime
people
book
had
club.
had pretty
Those
much
who have
enough
eaten
of the
tomorrow
Democrats
weekend,
and
history
Truman
of
and the
the
Korean
Great
War and all of that
Plains,
stuff. And in 1952, the American people voted in overwhelming numbers for war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Coming fall. The meeting will be held in the right alcove
In
of the
52,
auditorium and will promptly
the
start
American
at
people
7:17
liked Ike.
a.m. Please make arrangements to
And
attend
then,
this meeting
who was
as
his
important
VP?
paperwork and scheduling information will be distributed.
Nixon. That's right. Nixon takes that Alger Hiss case and he parlays it into being nominated as Vice President of the United States. But you know what? There's accusations in 1952 that Nixon may be corrupt.
Listen up. Please let Ms. Kurtz know if you experience a medical condition.
There are allegations that Nixon was accepting illegal campaign contributions and using campaign funds illegally for his own purposes. The Republicans tried to convince Eisenhower to dump Nixon from the ticket. And Nixon shamelessly used the new medium of television to make his case to the American people in what becomes known as the Checkers speech. He gets on TV in this living room set with his wife sitting there and the kids and the dog, and he sits there and he says, there have been some allegations made against me that I'm corrupt and crooked and whatnot, and I just wanted to let you know that I've earned everything I've got. I've never benefited from public office. The only gift that I've ever accepted was something that a man from Texas sent to me. It arrived in Baltimore in a box, and when I went to Baltimore to pick it up, and I looked in the box, I found inside a dog, black and a Cocker Spaniel puppy, black and white, spotted. And the kids named it Checkers. And the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And despite what the critics say, we're not giving the dog back. And it was this Checkers speech that saved Richard Nixon's political career. He remained on the ticket, and he got elected Vice President of the United States in 1952. So here we go. This is the beginning of Richard Nixon's national career. I find it hysterical that he's accused of corruption and that it was TV in 1952 that saved his bacon, because in 1960, it's TV that cost him the presidency. When he's running against Kennedy, Kennedy looks tan, youthful, and rested. Nixon looks, like his eyes are darting all over the place. And ultimately, it's TV that destroys Nixon in 1974 as president when he's accused of corruption. And he was corrupt.
Wasn't he like crazy?
I don't know. How would you describe crazy? I don't know. All right, there we go, folks. We're done. Are we done?
Mhm.